Hi, this is Noelle Ticky, and I am going to discuss Chapter 6, the next chapter that we read for our HR course. I chose Chapter 6 because it very much aligns to the work in addition to Chapter 5 that I get to do every day. Chapter 6 was primarily on staff development, so since a large majority of my responsibilities are to oversee professional development for Des Moines, there were definitely things in this chapter that were relevant to my day-to-day. So one of the things that the chapter started with, which I think is really important and something that's relevant in almost every school, is this idea that PLCs are most effective, are the most effective way to develop our staff. Which stands for Professional Learning Community, and it's really in Des Moines how one of the indicators that we look at to measure the health of the culture of a school. So if a school has a high functioning PLC or PLCs in place and the school functions as a PLC, then that's a good indicator to us that they are ready to take on any improvement effort. Without that very important structure in place, it's difficult to get any kind of momentum going, and it's likely that there won't be any changes that'll truly take hold for that school without that. One of the things that's discussed on page 178 is this idea that when we train or when we look at building the capacity of the adults in the organization, that we have to treat it as education and not training. I think this is an important idea, and it really brings me back to some characteristics of adult learning. So it caused me to do some additional research and research that we've done within my department over the past several years, and it really boils down to some principles, or 6 principles that are foundational for us to keep in mind when designing adult learning experiences. So the first of those is that adults are self-motivated. It's important to remind ourselves that we cannot always treat them like we do students under the age of 18, that they are attending training and engaging in that development, usually because they want to and it's part of their professional responsibilities, versus being forced to be there. The second guiding principle is that we need to remember to use their life experiences to facilitate learning. So it's important to honor the experiences that those in the room have, and to create opportunities for them to tap into those experiences and connect it to new learning. The third principle to keep in mind is that adult learners are task and goal oriented. So it very much ties into the next principle, which is relevance. So in order for adult learners to have their needs met, they want to engage in problem solving and real life scenarios. And that's important when designing learning, that they have the opportunity to do that. And the last one, or the last two, are that the learning is practical. They need to see clearly what's in it for them. Again, it's not always mandatory that they attend, so finding those connections are important. And then the last one is that adult learners want to be seen as equals. So it's important that we value their experience that they're bringing to the table, and in some cases put them in as the role of the expert, and use the expertise that's in the room rather than the traditional approach of kind of the sage on the stage and the teacher being the one with all of the knowledge. So the good news is that I connected right away after reading this chapter that in Iowa we currently have a model that very much supports how we go about selecting, delivering, and monitoring professional development in our schools. And it's the Iowa Professional Development Model. And as a review, there are kind of 6 steps to the Iowa Professional Development Model that I think are relevant here. The first step being that we need to collect and analyze student data. So the student data is really what should guide our selection of an initiative for whatever improvement we're choosing to take on. The next phase of that would be then to engage in goal setting. And this would be goal setting with a variety of stakeholders at the table, not just the higher ups or the administration. And it's important to keep in mind that whatever goals that we set for our professional learning are, there's a direct impact on students. The third one is to select content. This is often the first thing that we do. We kind of skip over those first two. But when selecting content, it must be research-based and have a strong theory and research behind it before we jump in. And also it's important to look at the research base and is it applicable to your environment. So in other words, something might have a strong research base, but maybe not research based in an urban setting. And so that would be something that we would need to look for. The next phase in the Iowa Professional Development Model is designing it. And as we design learning experiences for our adults, I think this is where that adult learning theory comes into play, to return back to what is it we know about adult learners. And then make sure that our learning experiences include theory, demonstration, and practice. If we only engage in theory, sometimes it'll lack the relevance and the real world connection. If we only engaged in demonstration, it won't always transfer to day-to-day, which is why we also need to include opportunities for the adults in the room to practice. And this is really where those PLCs come into play. So all of those exist that within this ongoing cycle. And so that's where we learn, we monitor, and we adjust, often studying implementation data, just like we look at student formative data when deciding what our next moves are. So as we're designing future supports for teachers, making sure we're getting into classrooms, looking at implementation, and figuring out what it is we need to adjust to meet their needs, and frankly asking them what they need. So never taking on the role of expert and assuming that we know better than the teachers themselves. And then the last phase of the Iowa Professional Development Model is the summative evaluation. So oftentimes we move on to something very quickly. We say, well, that didn't work, and we find something new, or it's the next best thing or the next fad, but rarely do we engage in program evaluation to say, what worked, what didn't work, and if it didn't work, why didn't it work, so that we don't keep repeating the same mistakes. So everything that was discussed regarding staff development in this chapter, I feel like is reflective of best practice, but it's also important to know that we don't need to reinvent the wheel, that we have an Iowa Professional Development Model in place, and if we follow that, we will likely be meeting the needs of the folks in our schools, and most importantly, the students that we serve.